They say the land keeps its own counsel, quiet until it isn't. I learned that the hard way on a piece of ground I thought I'd earned the right to understand after 30 years of coaxing rivers into obedience and convincing floodwater to go somewhere else. My name is Tom Grady, 57 years old, widower, retired Army Corps of Engineers. I live on the ragged edge of Willow Creek Estates, a subdivision carved out of old Virginia pasture land 25 years ago. My place sits at the bottom of a gentle slope, anchored by a weathered red barn that's older than the cul-de-sac across the road. The barn's paint has gone the color of dried blood, and the tin roof sings when the wind shifts, a low, mournful note that always makes me think of Ellen humming while she shelled peas on the porch. Every spring, before the dogwoods bloom along the fence line in soft pink explosions, I walk the shallow ditch that runs along the barn's north wall. It's nothing fancy, just a foot-deep channel worn smooth by decades of runoff from the hill behind the neighborhood. That ditch was my morning ritual, same as feeding the chickens or oiling the gate hinges. It kept the water moving, kept the barn dry, kept the past from flooding back in. I'd run my hand along the damp earth the way another man might stroke a dog's head, feeling the cool pulse of the ground beneath my palm, and for a moment the ache in my chest would ease. I bought the place in 2007, 6 months after Ellen's funeral. The cancer took her fast, 3 months from diagnosis to the last breath she drew in our bed, while I held her hand and pretended I wasn't falling apart. The realtor called it rustic charm. I called it breathing room. 5 acres, a sagging porch, and a barn that smelled of sweet hay and old promises. My kids were already grown, Sarah off to veterinary school in Colorado, her voice cracking over the phone when she said she couldn't come home for the closing. Jake deployed with the 82nd Airborne, sending emails from some dust-choked base in Kandahar that always ended with "Tell Mom I love her." I didn't have the heart to correct him. The house felt too big, every corner echoing with her absence, so I moved my recliner into the barn loft and let the chickens have the run of the yard. The ditch came with the deed. I found it marked on the original plat map, a faint blue line labeled Overland Flow Path, Do Not Obstruct. I respected that. After Hurricane Isabel tore through in '03 and turned half the county into a lake, I knew better than to argue with gravity. I widened it myself that first spring, hands blistered from the shovel, sweat mixing with tears I refused to acknowledge. Ellen would have laughed at me crying over dirt. "Water always wins, Tom," she'd say. "Best to give it a polite path." Willow Creek used to be sleepy. Folks waved from riding mowers, kids biked to the pool in packs that smelled of sunscreen and chlorine, and the Homeowners Association mailed newsletters about mulch colors and mailbox height. I ignored them. After 30 years of building levees in Louisiana, drainage culverts in Kandahar, and emergency berms during Katrina, nights spent hip-deep in black water while radios screamed for medevac, I figured a retired master sergeant could be left alone with his coffee and his chickens. I kept the fence painted a soft barn red that Ellen picked out, the grass cut short enough to spot copperheads before they struck, and the ditch clear of leaves every March. I'd sit on the tailgate of my old Ford with a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the water slide past like a secret being whispered to the retention pond downstream. Nobody complained. Then Margaret Ellison took over the board. Margaret moved in 3 doors down in 2019, fresh from a corner office in Richmond where she'd managed real estate portfolios worth more than our entire neighborhood. She wore blazers the color of storm clouds and carried a leather binder like a field manual. Her husband traveled for work. Her kids were grown and gone. She filled the void with power. New rules arrived weekly. No visible compost bins. Mine smelled of coffee grounds and eggshells, a scent Ellen used to call breakfast for the soil. No clotheslines. I hung my shirts anyway, letting the sun bleach out the grief stains. No unauthorized depressions in the landscape. My ditch, apparently, qualified. The first letter came on heavy cream stock, sealed with a gold foil emblem that caught the light like a warning. It called the ditch a visual disruption to communal uniformity and gave me 30 days to fill it or face fines starting at $200 a day. I laughed until I read the part about contractors acting on my behalf if I refused. The laugh died in my throat, replaced by a cold knot just under my ribs. The same knot I felt the day the chaplain knocked on my door in Baghdad to tell me my platoon sergeant didn't make it. I sat at the kitchen table under the single bulb that buzzed like a trapped fly and typed a polite reply on my ancient Dell, fingers stiff from old shrapnel wounds. I cited the original plat map, attached photos of the ditch in 1998 when it saved the barn during a nor'easter, included the county's own stormwater study that labeled it a designated overland flow path. I even drove to the courthouse and paid $6 for a certified copy of the 2005 hydrology report, the clerk raising an eyebrow at the tremor in my hands. No answer. A second letter arrived, colder, threatening legal action for repetitive interference with association operations. I folded it into a paper airplane and sailed it into the wood stove, watching the edges curl black before the flames took it. The knot in my chest tightened. I poured a bourbon, neat, and raised the glass to the dark corner where Ellen's rocking chair still sat. "They're coming for your ditch, darlin'," I whispered. The silence answered with the tick of the old wall clock. I drove to the county engineering office instead, the truck's tires humming over potholes that hadn't been there last year. Frank Delaney, an old colleague from a flood mitigation task force after Hurricane Matthew, pulled the files without asking why. He spread the topo map across his desk, tracing the blue line with a thick finger gone soft from desk work. "Tom," he said, voice low, "this ditch is on the master drainage plan. It carries runoff from lots 38 through 44. Filling it is begging for trouble. I told him trouble was already knocking. Frank leaned back, chair creaking like old bones. Document everything. Photos, timestamps, rainfall totals. If they touch that channel, the county will have to cite them. I bought a waterproof camera at the hardware store and started a logbook the way I once kept convoy reports in Iraq. Date, time, weather, water depth measured with a carpenter's ruler. Every entry felt like a prayer. 3 weeks later, I came home from the feed store, the truck bed loaded with layer pellets and a new axe handle. The skid steer loader was parked on my grass, engine idling like an impatient dog. 2 guys in orange vests were dumping gravel into my ditch while a third laid pavers in perfect rows, the clack of stone on stone sharp as gunfire. A stack of boxwoods waited on pallets, roots wrapped in burlap like tiny hostages. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in cream heels, arms folded, binder tucked under one elbow. We're upgrading the perimeter, she said before I could speak. It'll look uniform with the new streetscape. I pointed at the water already backing up behind the fresh fill, a dark mirror reflecting the sky and my own face. Older than I remembered, eyes red from sleepless nights. Uniform doesn't stop 6 inches of rain, Margaret. She smiled the way officers smile at troops who question orders. The board voted. Progress waits for no one. One of the workers, a kid with a sunburned neck and a tattoo of a carp on his forearm, met my eyes and shrugged. Just following the work orders, sir. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment I saw my own son in him, 22, far from home, following orders that might kill him. I stood in the yard until the loader rolled away, leaving a scar of gravel and stone where my ditch had been. The boxwoods looked ridiculous, like prom corsages on a corpse. That night the barn smelled of wet earth and betrayal. I sat on a hay bale with a single bulb swinging overhead, casting shadows that danced like memories I couldn't outrun. The first drops hit the tin roof like incoming mortar rounds, soft at first, then harder, a drumbeat that matched the pulse in my temples. Ellen used to call that sound the sky clearing its throat. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, raised the glass to the dark, and drank to her memory. The liquor burned, but not as much as the sight of my ditch buried under someone else's idea of beauty. I opened my logbook and wrote in a hand that shook only slightly. Day 1 without the ditch. Water already pooling at barn foundation. Temperature 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind WSW, 12 miles per hour. Forecast, scattered showers. I added a note in the margin. Ellen, they took your river. The storm that followed wasn't the worst I'd seen, but it was enough to crack something open inside me. By noon the next day, water sheeted across the lawn in silver ribbons, hunting for lower ground. I watched from the porch, coffee gone cold in my hand, as it found the clubhouse, a glass and vinyl palace the board had financed with a special assessment nobody voted on. The building sat 20 feet below my barn, perched on a shelf of filled dirt that had never been properly compacted. I'd pointed that out at a meeting once, standing in the back row with my arms crossed. Margaret had cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Now the parking lot turned into a lake the color of weak tea. Silt poured through the side door like wet cement, carrying lawn chairs and yoga mats in its wake. The yoga studio's neon sign flickered, pink, then white, then dark. By nightfall the patio had collapsed into a sinkhole the size of a pickup truck, the concrete slabs tilting like tombstones. At dawn Margaret stood ankle-deep in mud, phone to her ear, staring at the wreckage. Her blazer was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her hair was plastered to her forehead in dark ribbons. She didn't speak when I walked past carrying a shovel, the weight of it familiar in my calloused hands. She didn't need to. The earth had done the talking, and its voice was thick with centuries of patience finally spent. I spent the next day printing every email, every photo, every rainfall chart on the ancient printer that jammed twice and smelled of ozone. I drove to the county courthouse and filed a formal complaint under improper alteration of designated drainage. The clerk's stamp loud in the quiet lobby. Frank countersigned it without hesitation. I dropped copies in every mailbox on the street, including Margaret's. Hers slid under the door with a soft thud that felt like a heartbeat. That evening she knocked on my door, just as the sun bled out behind the hills. Her hair was flat from the rain, her voice small, almost childlike. We'd like your help planning the repair. The knot in my chest twisted so hard I tasted metal. I almost shut the door. Instead I said, you didn't want my help when it could have prevented this. My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated myself for it. She looked at the ground, water dripping from her eyelashes. We were wrong. I told her wrong had a price, and the price was coming due. She left without another word. I watched her walk back through the puddles, heels clicking like spent casings on concrete, and felt something inside me shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in the wall I'd built around my grief. Spring turned wetter than usual. The Farmer's Almanac called for above-average rainfall. The county issued flood watches 3 times in 2 weeks, each one a reminder that the sky hadn't finished with us. I reinforced the barn's foundation with sandbags stacked like soldiers, rebuilt the emergency spillway I'd dug in '08, the night Ellen and I fought the water with nothing but shovels and stubbornness. I could still feel the ghost of her hand in mine, slick with mud, her laughter breathless as we carved a new path for the flood. Sarah called from Colorado, her voice thin with worry over the crackling connection. Dad, sell the place. Move closer to us. You don't have to prove anything. I told her the barn was the only address I had left that still knew Ellen's name. that still held the echo of her bare feet on the pine floorboards. She didn't argue, but I heard her crying after she hung up. The second storm hit in late April, for inches in 36 hours, the kind of rain that soaks through your soul. I laid sandbags behind the barn until my shoulders screamed and prayed the old spillway would hold. Margaret's SUV sat in the clubhouse lot, too close to the slope, its silver paint gleaming like a target. I ran through the downpour, boots sliding on the slick grass, and pounded on the glass door with a fist that had once broken a man's jaw in a bar in Baton Rouge. She opened it wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide and frightened, the same eyes I'd seen on new lieutenants during their first mortar attack. Move the car now. We made it out just as a slab of hillside let go with a sound like the world tearing open. Mud surged across the asphalt in a slow, inexorable wave, swallowing the espresso bar, the faux stone pillars, the dreams of perfection. The building groaned like a wounded animal, glass shattering in a symphony of surrender. When the rain eased to a whisper, the clubhouse roof jutted from the sludge like a half-sunken ship, its proud lines humbled by the earth's quiet rage. The board resigned that night in Paul Henderson's garage, lit by camping lanterns and the glow of a dozen cell phone screens. Nobody clapped. Esther Garcia, whose heirloom peonies had washed away in the first flood, stood up first. You ignored him. You threatened him. And now my garden's gone. Her voice broke on the last word, and she sat down hard, shoulders shaking. Paul tried to interrupt. Esther kept talking until her voice cracked like thin ice. Margaret sat in the corner, arms wrapped around herself, silent as a grave. The county fined the association 6 figures for unpermitted grading, the notice delivered by a deputy who looked barely old enough to shave. Insurance denied the claim, gross negligence, the letter said in cold black type. Lawsuits followed from 3 homeowners whose foundations cracked like old promises. I testified for 45 minutes in the municipal hearing room, the air thick with the smell of lemon polish and desperation. I laid out the plat map, the hydrology report, the time-stamped photos of contractors filling my ditch without a permit. My voice stayed steady, the way it had when I briefed colonels on flood risk in rooms that smelled of coffee and fear. The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair and no patience for nonsense, asked Margaret one question. Did you consult any engineer before altering a designated drainage feature? Margaret's answer was barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the table. No, the ruling came down the next week. My ditch was now protected infrastructure. No one would touch it again without a permit, a hydrology study, and my signature. The barn exhaled, a long, slow breath I felt in my bones. Margaret moved in with her sister in Chesterfield for a month. Rumor said she sat on the porch every morning staring at nothing. When she came back, she knocked on my barn door carrying a notebook and a travel mug of coffee that steamed in the cool air. Teach me, she said, and for the first time her voice didn't carry the weight of a title. I almost laughed. Instead, I handed her a shovel, the handle worn smooth by my own hands and Ellen's. Start by learning what dirt feels like when it's saturated. We spent the morning digging test pits along the old flow path, the earth cool and heavy, smelling of iron and secrets. She asked questions, good ones, about soil porosity, infiltration rates, the difference between a swale and a bioswale. By noon her blazer was ruined and her hands blistered, the skin splitting in thin red lines. She didn't complain. When she wiped sweat from her brow, she left a streak of mud like war paint. We started small, rebuilding the ditch wider, deeper, lined with riprap and native switchgrass that waved in the breeze like green flags of surrender. Neighbors showed up uninvited, drawn by the sound of shovels and the smell of possibility. Paul from 3 doors down, who once complained about my compost smell and now carried a wheelbarrow with a sheepish grin. Esther, whose prize roses drowned, and who now planted willow cuttings with tears in her eyes. Even young Dylan, home from Virginia Tech with a drone and a hydrology textbook, his headphones around his neck like a stethoscope. We mapped every yard with string lines and laser levels, the sun hot on our necks, the air thick with the scent of turned earth. Paul ripped out his failing retaining wall and installed perforated pipe, his bad knee buckling but his jaw set. Esther planted willow cuttings along the new swale to stabilize the bank, whispering to each one as if it were a child. Dylan flew his drone at dawn, stitching together aerial photos into a 3D model of the watershed, his face alight with the kind of focus I hadn't seen since Jake was 12 and building forts in the backyard. The county engineer stopped by unannounced and ended up staying for lunch, eating Esther's cornbread with his hands and declaring it the best he'd had since his grandmother's kitchen. The clubhouse site became a terraced rain garden, 3 levels of native plants, stone-check dams, a gravel overflow path that doubled as a walking trail where kids now hunted for frogs. They called the main channel Grady Creek and left painted rocks along the banks like offerings. On Saturdays we held workshops under a pop-up canopy that flapped in the breeze. How to read a topo map, how to calculate runoff volume, how to tell if your yard is a sponge or a sluice. Margaret took notes in the back row, hair in a ponytail, boots caked with mud, her pen moving furiously across the pages. One evening, she left a book on my porch, coexisting with urban water. Inside she'd written in careful script, "You were right about the land. Thank you for not walking away." I kept the book on the workbench next to my compass, its spine uncracked, but its presence a quiet weight. Summer settled in hot and dry, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. The new system drank the occasional thunderstorm without a hiccup, the water moving with a grace that felt like forgiveness. Fireflies blinked above the switchgrass at dusk, their lights soft as memories. I still checked the ditch every morning, but now I carried a thermos and shared it with whoever showed up. Paul with his bad knee and his quiet apologies, Esther with her sun hat and her stories of roses that would bloom again, Dylan with his laptop and his dreams of grad school. Margaret started walking the ridge at sunrise, notebook in hand, pausing to sketch erosion patterns or measure flow velocity with a homemade we're made from a 2x4 and a coffee can. We didn't talk about the past much. Some things are better left buried under good soil and new growth. The county gave Willow Creek a Resilience Award in September, the ceremony held in the rain garden under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They wanted to put my name on the plaque. I told them to scratch it off and engrave "Listen to the Land" instead. They did. Sarah flew in with her new baby, a girl with Ellen's eyes. Jake FaceTimed from Fort Liberty, his face thinner than I remembered, but his smile wide. When the county commissioner handed me the plaque, I passed it to Margaret. She held it like it weighed 1,000 pounds, her fingers tracing the letters as if they were braille. The lawsuit settled out of court. The old board paid restitution from personal accounts, their signatures shaky on the checks. A new community council meets the first Thursday of every month under the same canopy, decisions posted on a corkboard by the mailbox where anyone can read them in the slanting afternoon light. Nobody threatens fines anymore. When storms come, we open the spillways and watch the water do what it's always done: move, carve, remind us who's really in charge with a patience that humbles us all. The barn still smells of sweet hay and old promises, of coffee and bourbon, and the faint ghost of Ellen's lavender soap. I still pour 2 fingers on quiet nights and raise a glass to the dark corner where her rocking chair waits. The ditch runs clear, steady, obedient, its voice a soft murmur that says we finally learned to listen. What about you? Ever watch someone in power ignore a warning until the consequences hit home, like a freight train? Ever stand your ground when the crowd wanted you silent, when your hands shook but your voice didn't? Drop your story in the comments, especially if you've faced bullying disguised as rules or seen nature deliver justice when people wouldn't. Tell me where you draw the line between authority and arrogance, between protecting your home and rolling over for the clipboard brigade. I read every one, and I'll be here with the coffee when you do.